first speaker probably needs no introduction with most of you, Phil Terrie. Phil's a resident of Ithaca and Long Lake. He's Professor Emeritus of American Studies at Bowling Green University, the author of Contested Terrain, a history of the Adirondack conservation movement, among many other notable books. And now Phil will give us his perspective on where the Adirondack Park is today. Phil, take it away.
Can I do without the mic?
No.
Okay. Sorry to hear that. All right, I'm going to talk a little bit about how we got here and let everybody else take it off from there. And I have a number of points that I want to dwell on. The first of which is the way that the Adirondacks is of special concern in New York State. Like no other part of New York, the Adirondacks has always been an area of state interest. Now, that's not to say that other areas aren't important and that should be equally of interest, but they have not been historically. The Adirondacks has occupied a niche in New York geography, politics, and culture that makes it a special place because it is so important to the welfare of the state. And the reasons for this we'll talk about, and we're going to see how those add up to and get us to where we are today. The first of those reasons is water. The Adirondacks was significant in the history of New York State because it is the headwaters of so many important watersheds for this state, including those that are essential to transportation, recreation, and all forms of commerce. The other is of vast open spaces of forest land. And these have been a concern to the state, and the protection of these has been seen as an issue that the state has that is essential to the welfare of the state of New York, which is not to say that other places aren't important, but the state has demonstrated this interest in special ways in the Adirondacks throughout the time that there has been human contact with this area. And that leads us to where we are today. That means that we have a variety of understandings of what the Adirondacks is. One of them is of the places of water and open space, and another understanding is of a frontier, local communities and people who live here. And as we all know, this has been a source of conflict since politics has been involved in the Adirondacks at all. Now, in the 19th century, because of the water, the open space, the state began to think that matters were fragile, that things were not going as they might otherwise be, that there was a concern that something had to be protected. And I'm going to run through this real quick about how we got to where we are now. This is an engraving from Harper's Magazine in the 1880s, a feeder of the Hudson as it was, a feeder of the Hudson as it is. And this was part of a campaign to alert the people of the state that things were going wrong in the Adirondacks, that the watershed that was so vital to the state was in danger. And this led to, of course, the Forest Reserve, the Adirondack Park. This is the 1892 park line. And as an aside, I've always wondered what would our history be like if that line had stayed the same. That was a much smaller park in 1892 than it is today. And I think that our political history would be very different if that line had stayed where it is. And then, of course, the constitutional protections of the Forest Reserve, written in 1894, going into effect on January 1st, 1895. And that is history that we're all familiar with. I could never forbear to put these words up on the screen because they are so magnificent. The cadence, that's one of the greatest pieces of prose I've ever seen. It's Miltonic in its magnificence. We all know it well. Paul Schaefer of the Association once set up an engraving of those words, Article 14, Section 1, and it's on the wall of my camp in Long Lake right now. Because of all the frenzy of conservation activity in the 1880s and 90s, we had the beginnings of what we have now, which is an Adirondack that is really two places. Before the 80s, the Adirondacks was one place. It was the North Woods. It was just this undifferentiated, vast open space that people went to or exploited or lived in or one thing or another. Once the conservation frenzy of the 80s and 90s occurred, we have the Forest Reserve and we have private lands. The Adirondacks began a slow, inexorable, and recently very dramatic process of becoming two different places. The Forest Reserve, the backcountry, and the private lands, which is very different. And we want to look at how that has been a part of our history. So we have the public lands, which are protected like this, and then we have the history of the private lands of the Adirondacks, which mostly is ignored up until the middle of the 20th century. This is a map of the Adirondack League Club, as it was at the height of its holdings near Old Forge in about 1891, which is roughly when it was founded. Actually, I think the map is 91, that's a little bit later. We have the great camps, the private lands that belong to wealthy families. This is Pine Knot, and we know that they were a significant part of the culture here, but not really on the state radar. And of course, we have huge areas of the Adirondacks are owned by woods products companies, and their abuses led to the conservation activity of the 80s and 90s, and they continue to be a significant player in our story for some years. But in general, and one other kind of private land in the Adirondacks are the towns, which are not on the radar at all, are pretty much ignored by the state. This is Long Lake, and when the park was established in 1892, most people assumed that the state would end up owning all the land inside the blue line. How that was going to be accomplished, nobody thought about. It never did happen, obviously. And we have various kinds of places in the Adirondacks. But mostly the state is paying attention to the private land, to the public land, the Forest Reserve, and developed it as a recreational preserve. We have construction of lean-tos, we have construction of fire towers. Interestingly, the fire towers are mostly near highways, and the automobile becomes a major player in the story of the Adirondacks throughout this time, and we'll talk about that in a minute or two. But in general, the state is paying no attention to private land throughout the first half of the 20th century, except for the sign law. Now, Peter Bauer had a really nice piece in the Adirondack Almanac this week about the importance of the sign law, and this clipping was attached to it. Thank John Warren for that. And it's an interesting item because it shows the beginning, a lot of the beginnings of what we've got. It shows the state demonstrating its interest in park-wide issues. It passed a law forbidding off-the-premises advertising in the Adirondacks. Get rid of billboards because it interfered with the scenic splendor of the Adirondacks. And here we have local resistance to this demonstration of state interest in the Adirondacks. Somebody says, I'm not going to go along with that. And it's a very telling moment, I think. But it doesn't really surface for quite some time. So what's going on in the first half of the 20th century with private land in the Adirondacks? And the key item here is the automobile. This is a motor court in the central Adirondacks, and I think it's an especially good picture because there's a gas station in this picture. The automobile changes the story in the Adirondacks, where it has been inaccessible. It's not only rich people can afford to get here. Generally, the people who live in Pine Knot and places like that. And the Adirondacks, once the automobile is a part of middle-class life, and once the state hardens the roads, which it is doing throughout the 20s and 30s, the Adirondacks becomes a different place. And the existence of private land, previously largely undeveloped, becomes a major attribute of the Adirondack story. And one of the first demonstrations of this is the creation of a middle-class tourist destination. And motorports are a major player. That's a very important symbol of what's going on in the Adirondacks. And I think that is one of the most, that's an important historic document right there. Okay. The automobile is the road of whiteface. The automobile continues to be the driving force in changing the picture of the Adirondacks. People who drive their cars up to the Adirondacks throughout this time discover this is a pretty neat place. I'd like to have a piece of my own land up there. This is a development of lakeshore cottages, vacation homes, second homes. The second homes only belong to Vanderbilts, and Rockefellers, and Whitneys. They constitute a culturally significant player in this story, but not an environmentally significant player. When second homes become like this, it's an environmental issue that the state is slowly going to start to pay attention to. So up until World War II, it doesn't seem like a pressing issue because we're like everybody. When a resource seems abundant, we don't worry about it running out. And the lake shores are slowly being developed along these lines, but it seems like a benign development, an issue that is not terribly significant for the future of the park. World War II comes along, the country is growing, it's affluent, people are thinking about the land in different ways. The idea of regional zoning develops largely after World War II. This is Levittown, which is New York State, which is one of the most significant things happening in American culture in both World War II years, and there are many of these around the country. So our public authorities begin to think about, should we be developing our resources helter-skelter in an unplanned, unfocused way? And throughout the 50s and 60s, there is a movement toward regional zoning. And this is all obviously heading toward the park agency. This is often referred to as the Quiet Revolution. There's a famous report by Fossum and Davies about the need for regional planning and regional zoning. And this has an impact here and elsewhere. And other parts of the country begin to think about not just zoning our urban areas to have commercial, industrial, residential, which is a history of zoning that has a longer story, but the idea of regions, of larger places that need to have some planning. We get this in the Oregon coast, California coast, Lake Tahoe, other parts of the country begin to think about the need for long-range planning and zoning for what's the best use of this asset that we have here. And in the Adirondacks, it's obviously the private land that we're concerned about. It becomes incredibly pressing with the completion of the Northway in 1967, where the Adirondacks almost overnight become significantly closer to New York City. It had not been so close before. When you had to come up Route 9 to the Adirondacks from Westchester or Manhattan, it took a long time. With the completion of the Northway, all of the forces that had been in play before that, the growth of second homes, the appeal of the Adirondacks to an increasingly affluent population, a middle-class population, with time and energy and money to be able to go other places. The Adirondacks, it goes through a revolution. And as many of us know, this leads to the Temporary Study Commission in 1968, and its report to the state. 1970, 181 recommendations for planning, and 71, Park Agency, 72, the State Land Master Plan, 73, Private Land Use Development Plan. And since then, the theme in the Adirondacks that I want to get back to, through all these things, is the Adirondacks as two places. And in the 40 years since the Park Agency, we have incredible acquisitions, incredible additions to the one side of the Adirondacks that is the backcountry. For instance, one of the next great ones will be Boreas Ponds. And I like that slide, it's got me and my son and that canoe in the left side there. And we all hope this will soon be a part of the Forest Reserve. And, you know, the story of easements and acquisitions in the last 30 years is stunning. We're all familiar with that. It is truly a miraculous thing. The Domtar, Champion, International Paper, Finch Prime, it's wonderful. What about the other half? What's going on in the other half of the Adirondacks? We have shoreline development that is the restrictions in the Park Agency, the private land plan of 1973 were watered down in the legislature, and the private shorelines have largely been lost in the last 40 years. The development of privately owned lake and river shores has been we've lost it. There's still a few left. There's a great one on Long Lake, undeveloped, but the private lands, the lake and river shores are inadequately protected. And now the houses are moving up the mountains. Ridgeline development is one of our next great issues. We've had the Park Agency hampered by lack of funding, lack of staff, the failure of towns to develop their own plans in concert with the Park Agency, which again it had to do with lack of staff and funding, and of course lack of interest on the part of the towns doing this. But it's a failure of the last 40 years that we have not overcome. Whether or not the encouragement of the towns to develop their own plans, to work to control or develop these developments like this appropriately is one of the questions that we need to have answered today and in the next few years. Okay, finish up then. I just want to summarize where we are today at this point. We have a backcountry that is in pretty good shape, well protected. This is one of my favorite spots in the Adirondack, around Pond, in northern Hamilton County. And we have the other Adirondacks. Maybe this is what we want. Maybe this kind of division is what is inevitable, is what is going to happen, is what the future holds for the Adirondacks. Maybe not. But as Dick pointed out, we have a plan that has not significantly changed in 40 years. And I look forward a lot for the rest of the day here to seeing what kinds of things could be done to channel this in appropriate ways, to develop those areas that can be developed in appropriate ways, continue our protections of the backcountry, and somehow establish and focus on the connections between those two areas. Because right now they are not. They are two different universes. We have this, we have the back.